The Chicago Bears' initial 53-man roster is set with a few surprises and a few more moves likely on the way.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. Today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. On the show today, we are live on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, breaking down this Chicago Bears initial 53-man roster. The keyword there being initial. The roster that they submitted to the NFL at the Tuesday afternoon deadline, where they had to be down to at least the first set of 53 players. From here, there will be a waiver process that runs through Wednesday morning, where they will then have a chance to claim players. They'll have the opportunity to place players on injured reserve and get a more finalized 53-man roster in place before week one. But for now, we'll look at some of the surprise cuts, some of the surprise keeps, the guys who made the roster that maybe we weren't expecting them to. We'll look at a really strong showing from this rookie class across this roster. And overall, we'll kind of take a bigger picture look at the strengths and weaknesses of where this team sits right now entering this regular season. So we did a roster prediction show here last week on trying to get a sense of how this 53-man group might end up playing out. Of course, it's an impossible task to get 100% right, but overall, I think we were fairly close in a lot of key areas as we look at this Bears 53-man roster across the board. 2 quarterbacks, 3 running backs, a fullback, 3 tight ends, and there's a controversy there because Jake Tongas is listed as a fullback on the Bears roster and on the Bears depth chart, but we'll get into him in a little bit, that he's really going to be the number 3 tight end when we're down to this depth chart. Right now, it's 7 wide receivers, it's 9 offensive linemen, 8 defensive linemen, 6 linebackers, 6 cornerbacks, 5 safeties, and your expected 3 special teams players. So overall, a similar balance to what we were expecting going in. I was most surprised by a pair of cuts in particular, that at guard, the team released veteran Michael Schofield, who they had brought in at the start of training camp, and at least at first was penciled in as your week 1 starter at right guard. Of course, once Tevin Jenkins returned from his quote-unquote injury situation that he was dealing with, he slowly worked his way into the starting lineup and now looks to be your week 1 starter at right guard. I don't think there's any questioning that at this point, unless they bring in some surprise player from outside of the organization. But for now, Tevin Jenkins is your starting right guard, and we sort of saw that coming. But I thought Michael Schofield, given that he's been like an 8-year starter in the NFL at guard for multiple teams, including a very similar offense as the Bears offense early in his career with the Denver Broncos, I thought he would still stick on as at least a consistent veteran backup that, if Jenkins gets hurt or something happens, whatever it might be, you could go to him and say, we have a guy who started a lot of games, and be a very, very valuable backup. Instead, the Bears opted to keep their 2 late-round guards that they drafted, Zachary Thomas and Ja'Tyre Carter, to be their backups at the guard position. Both of those guys played tackle in college as well and could potentially show some versatility there, but spent the preseason playing guard, and that's where we're going to project them. I still insist that the Bears could have released either one or both of those players and gotten them onto the practice squad, but I think it reflects a larger theme that we're seeing here from Ryan Poles in this first year roster cutdown of opting for the younger players, the developmental guys, as opposed to the veterans. Because this isn't a season where you're necessarily going to make the Super Bowl, might not even make the playoffs. It's a season of player development. And it seems that the Bears would rather have Zachary Thomas and Jatir Carter on the roster and essentially your top option as a backup guard, although Sam Mustipher can also be a backup guard option as well, but would rather have those players on the team developing as opposed to keeping Michael Schofield on that spot and trying to get those guys on the practice squad instead. The other surprise was one of the one we just mentioned there, Jake Tongas on there. We'll get into him as a very big surprise cut, but the one that I think I was expecting for the 53-man roster cutdown prediction that we didn't end up seeing was the running back Darrington Evans being cut and the Bears keeping 6th-round running back Treston Ebner. I thought there would be a chance that they keep both, but I was just surprised because Evans was a guy who was getting plenty of run in the preseason and more importantly was a top special teams contributor for them throughout that process. He was a first-team special teams guy, a four-phase type of player. He even surprised me as the gunner on the punt team that I thought for sure then, given how much they were using him and seeing him be successful in those special team snaps, that would be his key to making the 53-man roster as one of the backup running backs. With Ebner, we saw him get some kickoff return opportunities in the first game, and then occasionally he was around on a couple of other loose special team snaps here and there, but wasn't a guy that they were using a ton on special teams. And I didn't know if they'd keep a number 3 running back that hasn't been a big time contributor on special teams up to this point. Then I think defensively, the one Bears fans had circled was Thomas Graham Jr. at cornerback. Same thing with Tavon Young, to be honest, but he was placed on injured reserve. Graham was just straight up waived. A 6th-round pick last year, started a little bit, played really well, had a lot to like. And I kept floating it out there that, man, he didn't play at all in the preseason or training camp. And I was wondering, would the Bears keep a player that didn't play at all in the preseason or training camp? We saw the same fate now for Mario Edwards as well. And it was like, oh man, how can they get rid of Thomas Graham? I still think I would have kept Thomas Graham, but I'm hoping that if you've been a listener of this podcast or following along the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, that it wasn't as surprising to you because we keep mentioning it as a possibility that this regime just doesn't have the same connection to him as we did watching him last season, or as Ryan Pace would have as the general manager who drafted him. And I think there's still a pretty good chance they're going to be able to land Thomas Graham on the practice squad as well. We'll definitely keep a close eye out for any and all practice squad updates as we get through the rest of the week here. But I want to turn our attention to some of the guys who made the roster that would have been long shots at the start of training camp, but played hard in the preseason, played their way through, and now, at least for now, are on the Chicago Bears' initial 53-man roster. Next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at LinkedIn Jobs. As you gear up for the fall, you're going to need the right people on your team to help your small business fire on all cylinders. LinkedIn Jobs is here to make it easier to find the people you want to talk to faster and for free. You can create a free job in minutes on LinkedIn Jobs to reach your network and beyond to the world's largest professional network of over 810 million people. Then add your job and the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring, so your network can help you find the right people to hire. Simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. It's why small businesses rank LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus the leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the candidates you want to talk to faster. Did you know nearly 40 million job seekers visit LinkedIn every week? Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Today's episode of Locked On Bears is also brought to you by PrizePicks, the best way to make your Sundays that much more exciting. It's daily fantasy, but even better. Here's how it works. You pick 2 to 5 players, kind of like a daily fantasy, but instead of going up against other people and their teams, you decide whether they'll score more or less than their PrizePicks projection. And then you can win up to 10 times your money on any entry. There's no competing against other people. It's just you versus the PrizePicks projections. PrizePicks offers those projections on any sport that you watch, not just football, but NBA, MLB, NHL, golf, college football, college basketball, soccer, WNBA, NASCAR, tennis, combat sports, even cricket and Euro basketball, disc golf as well. It's crazy. There's everything you can play with at prizepicks.com. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less with safe and fast withdrawals on your way out as well. And they're currently operational in over 30 states and Canada. Download the PrizePick app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can get a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 when you use our promo code LOCKEDON. If you deposit $100, PrizePicks will give you $100. You deposit $50, you get $50. You get it. Don't forget to enter that promo code LOCKEDON at sign-up for that instant deposit match up to $100. This initial Bears 53-man roster had some names that could we go in the past and use hindsight and say, hey, at the beginning of August, would you have thought this guy was going to make the Bears 53-man roster? You might have thought you were crazy. I mean, there really was a great escalation for a few players in particular that fought their way through and said, yep, I belong on this 53-man roster. You can't cut me. You're going to lose me. I'm too valuable. You need to make me a part of this football team. We've already talked about him a little bit, but Jake Tongas, I'm not even sure I'm saying his name correctly, sticks as the number 3 tight end / fullback because he is listed as a fullback on the Bears depth chart and on the Bears roster, but the Bears don't have any other tight ends besides Cole Kmet and Ryan Griffin. They ended up letting go of tight end James O'Shaughnessy, who was given a non-football illness designation. Don't know what the situation is there. I wonder if that helped free up a spot for Jake Tongas, but I also think Tongas gives the Bears a certain versatility that they don't have with any other player. Again, listed at fullback, but I went and pulled his snaps from the preseason, and he played about 41 snaps at tight end compared to 22 snaps at wide receiver and just 21 snaps at fullback. So, yes, he was the quote-unquote backup fullback to Kari Blasingame, but he played a lot more tight end than fullback and even played a little bit more wide receiver than fullback. He can really move around and do a lot of different things. And I was joking on Twitter that I'm waiting for some over-the-top Bears fan or some blogger type group to come out and say, oh, Jake Tongas is going to be the Bears' Kyle Juszczyk, right? The same offensive system, a versatile pass-catching fullback, hybrid H-back type tight end guy that, can be exciting. But obviously, he's an undrafted free agent tight end out of Cal. We're not expecting him to come in and be a Pro Bowl caliber fullback weapon like Kyle Juszczyk. But I thought a good comparison that I saw on Twitter, I want to give a shout out to Jake at JTR_1994 said Joshua DeGuara from the Green Bay Packers was a guy that they drafted in the 4th round a couple of seasons ago. And he's a very similar build. And I think that's more the type of expectations or the type of role we could be looking for a guy like Tongas to kind of come in. Because Josiah DeGuara came in last season and had 245 yards and 25 catches and 2 touchdowns in a bigger role. As a rookie, he hardly played at all. He was a 3rd-round pick out of Cincinnati. I was thinking San Diego State in my head. But so I think there's some possibility there for Tongas to be a potential versatile move-around backfield versatile piece at tight end as well, understanding that he's the number 3 tight end and the number 2 fullback. So he's not going to be playing a ton, not going to be some sleeper for your fantasy team or anything like that, but a guy to keep an eye on as a real surprise keep on this 53-man roster. Also think you have to shout out Jack Sanborn as an undrafted rookie free agent linebacker out of Wisconsin. We kind of had an inkling after the first preseason game when he had such a game against the Kansas City Chiefs, probably going to make this Bears 53-man roster, but that wasn't obvious from the get-go. I mean, I have to say, having covered the Wisconsin Badgers a ton and having met Jack Sanborn and interviewed him a few times before, he's a good kid. I was pulling for him. I had a feeling he could come to a camp like this, play hard, impress the coaching staff, and offer a lot of special teams upside and be a dark horse 53-man roster candidate. But I don't know that I would have put money on that at the start of training camp, that's for sure, but really, really stood out well for him there. And then at cornerback, some big changes there with Tavon Young placed on season-long injured reserve. He's out for the year. Thomas Graham waived, trying to get him on the practice squad. Maybe by the time you hear this podcast, if you're at least listening to it later, maybe he'll already be on the practice squad or claimed by a team. But for now, he's a free agent. And making the team is Lamar Jackson, a former undrafted free agent who started a few games with the New York Jets. Or no, he might have been a draft pick now that I think about it. But regardless, he was the Bears starter in the preseason when they had injuries at the cornerback spot with Jalen Johnson not playing. And he was an undrafted free agent. Good, I'm glad I got that right. When Jalen Johnson was out, Lamar Jackson started. And then when Kyler Gordon was out or Kindle Vildor was out, Lamar Jackson was their go-to guy on the outside as their first backup off the bench. So he makes the 53-man roster, as does current undrafted rookie free agent Jalen Jones, giving the Bears 4 or 5 Joneses on this team right now. Velus Jones, Braxton Jones, Jalen Jones. They got Jalen Johnson as well, Justin Jones. There's a lot of Joneses on this Bears 53-man roster. There's going to be a lot of keeping up with the Joneses this season, but he's a guy who they trusted in the slot early as a top backup slot option, although Duke Shelley will also be a slot option for them. So clearly, again, a lot younger at the cornerback spot there, as opposed to a guy like Tavon Young, who was the veteran slot cornerback that we thought may be their starting slot cornerback this season. But instead, that will be Kyler Gordon, and then Lamar Jackson will probably be their top backup at that spot. 7th-round rookie Elijah Hicks makes the roster at safety as well, and kind of following a trend there of young Bears players, young draft picks making this 53-man roster. 10 of the 11 picks are on the 53, and the 11th is Doug Kramer, the center from Illinois, who was placed on injured reserve and will miss the entire season. Then you have the undrafted free agents, Jalen Jones, Jack Sanborn, and Jake Tongas, gives you 13 rookies on this 53-man roster. Plus, I think you got 6 or 7 guys that are all year 2 players. I mean, Justin Fields, Khalil Herbert, et cetera, et cetera. I think I saw Brad Biggs say 38% of the roster is rookies or year 2 players. So obviously a much, much younger Bears team and a young team of guys brought in by Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus as well, really putting their stance, their stake, their stamp, perhaps, third time's a charm there, on this Bears 53-man roster. So it kind of gives us a sense of some of the dynamics and the decision-making of this regime on where they wanted this roster to go. But coming up next, we'll take a look at how this roster stands overall, some of the strengths, the weaknesses, the spots they could look to still maybe add an outside player when you'll have N'Keal Harry likely going on injured reserve and creating at least one spot open up on this Bears 53-man roster next on Locked On Bears. Many of us have been at a point in our lives before where maybe money is a little bit tight. You feel like you're kind of going paycheck to paycheck. Maybe you can't quite afford to fill the whole gas tank full of gas, or you got another save the date coming up and wondering exactly how you're going to pay for that wedding gift. Well, this is where our friends at Dave can help. If you're living paycheck to paycheck or struggling to make ends meet, Dave can help you get out of a pinch when you really need it. Dave is the banking app that can help you get up to $500 instantly with extra cash. That's more money to fill your tank, buy a wedding gift, or catch up on bills. You can finally tackle those expenses that have been stressing you out without any hangups. There's no interest and there's no credit check needed. Millions of people have already downloaded the Dave app to get the financial relief they need with extra cash. So if you're in a pinch and need a little help, download Dave and think of it as a helping hand from future you. Download the Dave app from the App Store right now. That's DAVE. Sign up for an extra cash account and get up to $500 instantly. For terms and conditions, go to dave.com/legal. Instant transfer fees apply. Banking provided by Evolve. Member FDIC. We're really seeing this Bears 53-man roster evolve with so much turnover, and it really does feel a lot more like Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus's team. It's not a complete transition over, but I was counting with so many Bears players held over now gone, and Ryan Pace bringing a lot of them to the Atlanta Falcons. I saw the Bears offense has 9 players who were brought in by Ryan Pace. The Falcons offense has 5. So they're getting closer and closer in that split there as more and more Bears work their way over to Atlanta. And who knows, maybe there's still time for 1 or 2 more to get there. But when you take a step back and look big picture at this Chicago Bears 53-man roster, I think right away you see some strengths and weaknesses emerge. That first of all, there's a lot of depth on the offensive line, a lot of young players that they want to develop and grow, and clearly going with the youth over the veterans for now, with Riley Reif on the bench and Michael Schofield cut off of this team. There's a clear emphasis for some versatility now with pass catchers in Jake Tongas, and Ryan Griffin can be a pass catcher who can motion out at wide receiver. Kari Blasingame maybe catching some passes out of the backfield. Treston Ebner, Khalil Herbert, more pass-catching running backs in the backfield. I think they recognize that perhaps there will be some limitations at wide receiver, and that if they can get other players more involved in the passing game, that's going to be how they can better spread the ball around and not just have to be the all Darnell Mooney offense, at least, to kind of get things rolling here early on. It's still going to be a primarily Darnell Mooney offense, but I think being able to have other players that can be more than just a running back who carries the ball, or more than just a tight end who blocks and lines up in line, but guys that can line up a little bit of everywhere and do a lot of different things for your offense can help give Justin Fields a variety to work with. And I think there's some feeling like there's going to be some learning curves and some developmental bumps along the way, but the Bears offense is going to sort of live with those and hope that these younger players can keep kind of growing along the way. Where I think the biggest red flag jumps out at me now is the defensive line, particularly on the interior with, Justin Jones, Angelo Blackson, Khyiris Tonga, and Mike Pennel are your 4 defensive tackles. I think among them, the player with the highest career single-season sack total is Justin Jones, which came last season with 3. We've talked about some of the pass rush concerns on the interior before, but that was before when I thought Mario Edwards might be a part of that rotation. They had Trevon Coley they signed, who had a few sacks in the preseason. Micah Treadway showed some pass rushing upside, but Mike Pennel has always seemed more to me like more of a nose tackle than a 3 technique, and it feels like they don't have exactly a true backup 3 technique. Pennel kind of has the versatility to play both, but he's not a difference maker as a pass rusher, right? He has 2 career sacks. Sacks are not the sole way of measuring pass rush success, but when you start to do the numbers here on these interior defensive linemen, Justin Jones has 4.5 career sacks. Mike Pennel has 2 total career sacks. I don't think Khyiris Tonga has any career sacks, and as I quickly pull up Angelo Blackson's numbers as I'm talking, he has 8.5 over the course of his career, but collectively you barely have 15 total career sacks between your 4 defensive tackles. Again, I don't want to rely on sacks as the true measurement because pressure still matters a lot on the interior, and it doesn't always have to be sacks, but you just don't have any sort of proven pass rush on that interior. I think Jones can be capable, but one interior pass rusher does not create enough of an interior pass rush. You need to have somebody that you can rotate in there that can make a difference there, and it feels like Blackson, Pennel, and Tonga are like 3 nose tackles, and Justin Jones is kind of your 1-3 technique. Puts a lot of pressure on Robert Quinn then to be a difference maker there, and I think he's certainly capable of it. I think Travis Gibson can step into bigger roles, and Al-Qadim Muhammad and Dominique Robinson can rotate in and give you good enough at the defensive end position, certainly. But that interior, you're definitely going to need them to be great run blockers, great run stoppers, because they're not going to be, in theory, great pass rushers. And I wonder if that's not the first position I would look to for them to add another player when they likely are expected to place N'Keal Harry on short-term injured reserve so that they could bring him back later in the season. That would put them at 52, and you'd have room to bring in 1 more player. You would still have 6 wide receivers, so I don't think you need a 6th one of those. Jake Tongas is basically your number 3 tight end, so you don't need one of those. You could, but you don't need one of those. You got plenty of O-line depth, plenty of linebacker depth, plenty of secondary depth. Just feels to me like that's the biggest hole right there. More interior defensive line pass rush. Who knows? Maybe you look around at some of the great wide receivers. Well, great's a strong word, but some quality wide receivers were made available on 53-man roster cutdown days. Tyler Johnson from the Buccaneers, Preston Williams from the Dolphins, to name a few. And you can look around the league and find other teams' trash that might be the Bears' treasure. And they'll make those waiver decisions here pretty early on Wednesday, and we'll have a better sense of that. That certainly will break down on tomorrow's episode of Locked On Bears, whatever adjustments they make to this 53, and then we'll start looking ahead to this upcoming season. Before you know it, we'll be previewing week 1 and trying to get to all things regular season. But for now, this is where things are at. And I think it's important to check in bigger picture on the 53, because this happened last season where we looked at the first 53 and said, man, they're thin at cornerback and they're thin on the offensive line. And when they had injuries at cornerback and injuries on the offensive line, that was a huge problem for the team last season. So then when you look at this year's and say, yeah, they're thin on that interior defensive line, you wonder if there's going to be a pass rush trouble there. And I would also say they're short on experience at cornerback. I mean, Jalen Johnson, Kindle Vildor, Kyler Gordon are your 1, 2, 3. And then Lamar Jackson has made a few starts, but he's a former undrafted free agent. Jalen Jones is a current undrafted free agent. And Duke Shelley, a former 6th-round pick, hasn't shown a ton, but he's been around now this is his 3rd season, but played a little outside, played a little inside, but not a guy that you feel like you're in love with relying on. So if something happens to Jalen Johnson, Kyler Gordon, or Kindle Vildor, one of Jackson, Shelley, and Jones are going to be in there, and none of them strike me as like starting caliber cornerbacks. And I would have felt better with Tavon Young there, and Thomas Graham, I probably would have felt better with him there too. So some concerns about the cornerback depth, maybe some concerns about the linebacker depth, although I like the upside that they have there with like Sanborn and Caleb Johnson. Definite concerns about the defensive line depth, but I think offensive line depth feels a little bit better. You have some options there, young and old, to like. Wide receiver depth has always been a question mark, but we saw flashes from Sharp and Pettis that you feel like, okay, as that group gets healthier, you can start to piece something together there. And I'm excited to see what Jake Tongas does at the tight end fullback hybrid position as well. So I guess we'll just keep that in mind as we go through the season and see the ups and downs. If we were right to predict shortcomings, or if Ryan Poles and company know a lot more than we do. Certainly they know a lot more than we do, but we'll see ultimately how it plays out this regular season. I hope you'll keep coming back for more. Hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis right here on Locked On Bears. We here on the Locked On Podcast Network are your team every single day. And now if you're looking for your second listen after making Locked On Bears your first listen, you can go check out our Ultimate Pro Football Preview 2022. It's an 8-episode extravaganza to get you ready for this NFL season. The local experts of the Locked On Podcast Network, plus a betting angle from Lee Sterling on Locked On Bets, all combining into one ultimate NFL preview. Search Ultimate Pro Football Preview 2022 on your Odyssey app, on YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. We'll keep you up to date on what happens with the Bears. Roster moves happening fast and furious here over the next 48 hours. We'll be back with it for more of it tomorrow. And in the meantime, I hope that the Locked On Bears podcast gives you another opportunity to bear down.